Welcome back. This is part 3 of this intro series on how to deal with a pattern. So in part 1, we talked about what kinds of patterns there are and then when to use each kind. In part 2, we talked about how to pick the perfect pattern for your project and then how to calculate and how to prep your materials. So today, we are going to break down exactly what you will find inside a pattern envelope for a US commercial pattern, what's on the instructions, what all the markings on the pattern pieces mean, and how to take advantage of those markings when you're sewing. Now, your pattern envelope contains the tissue paper pattern pieces and the newsprint instructions. So pull out the instructions and open them up. On page 1, you will see the line art, a small numbered sketch of each pattern piece with a list of names for the piece numbers underneath, a list of pattern markings, sometimes a very small glossary of terms, and this series of pattern pieces on rectangles. This is how they recommend you lay out your pattern pieces on your fabric so that all the pieces are pointing in the right direction, and so there's as little fabric waste as possible. I definitely recommend using these fabric layout charts first because in addition to making your life a bit easier, they also ensure that you don't cut pieces out backwards or angle your pattern pieces the wrong way on the fabric, and this is very important. We will talk about why in a second. Now, let's look at your actual pattern pieces. It is weird the first time you see a pattern because this paper does look really flimsy and like cheap. Don't worry, you did not buy the wrong thing. This is what all commercial patterns are printed on, and I personally think it's actually more useful than sturdier paper. It's really compact, and it folds down so small that you can have a large pattern collection in a really small space. I used to make all of my own patterns with butcher paper like they taught us in college, and I ran out of storage space fast. Second, the fact that it's slightly transparent means that it's great once you start working with a fabric pattern like stripes because you can often see the pattern through the tissue paper so that you can see when you've positioned your pieces perfectly. You just have to be a little careful because the paper is delicate. Some patterns are only for one garment. Some, like this coat, are for one garment with a few style variations. And some, like this Jack Sparrow looking one, are for a whole outfit. And that's got shirt, pants, cravat, waistcoat, and coat. And if you are making every part of every garment in the pattern envelope, you will cut out all of the pattern pieces from the tissue paper. If you've got a pattern like this Jack Sparrow one with multiple garments, but you only want to make the coat, then you will look at the line art on your instructions or on the envelope. So that coat is labeled A. Look over at the pattern piece legend and then note the numbers of all the pieces labeled A. Then you will only cut out the pattern pieces with those numbers. When you cut out your pattern pieces, by the way, cut out each whole piece. Do not cut off the sizes you will not be using. Oh my God, that's so wasteful. I genuinely can't believe people do this. My skin crawls just thinking about it. Honestly, cut out the whole pattern piece. It is very easy to just fold back the edge of the pattern piece so you're just cutting out your size. And for curved areas which aren't easy to fold, I just cut out the fabric with the pattern piece resting on top of my scissors. Tissue paper is kind of sheer, so it's really easy to see where my scissors are cutting. I can see the pattern line I'm supposed to be cutting, and I don't have to cut into the tissue paper. There are other methods, but this is fast, and it's always worked really well for me. I make clothes for, honestly, countless different people, which is one reason I leave all the sizes on my pattern pieces intact. But honestly, even if I just made clothes for me, I'm not going to stay the same size all my life, and patterns are expensive. Besides, if I really needed a precise outline of the exact shape, there is a product called tracing paper, which you can get anywhere that sewing things are sold. One side of this is colored, and that color transfers to fabric or paper when you apply pressure. So you put it on your fabric, colored side down, and you put your pattern piece on top of that. And you put a few heavy things in all those layers so nothing moves around, and then you take a cheap blunt tracing wheel from like Joann's or Hobby Lobby or Walmart, and you trace all around the exact pattern line that you want to cut out. And you bear down enough to transfer the color, but not enough to tear your pattern piece. And the line that you traced with the wheel will be transferred to the fabric and your pattern piece will remain intact. Also, keeping your pieces intact will help you learn how patterns work better. Consistently seeing the way that patterns expand for different sizes has taught me a lot about how and where to scale up or take in my own patterns. Bodice pieces like this made me start thinking about the body as a round shape. It helped me understand why shoulder pieces like that strap are not just cut wider for larger sizes, they also have to be cut taller. Anyway, that's why this is a hill that I will die on. You may decide, though, that none of this is important to you, and that is perfectly fine. Do what works best for you, because you're the one sewing your things, not me. Now, your pattern pieces, once you pull them out of the envelope and you've cut them out, they will have a lot of fold wrinkles, which is not ideal if you want to cut your fabric accurately. So you can iron them flat. You set your iron to a medium or medium-high setting, and you iron those pieces flat. By the way, if you're like me, when you tear those pieces, you can tape them back together with clear tape, but make sure you only put tape on one side of the tissue paper. It really doesn't matter which side, just pick one and be consistent so you never have to wonder which side you put tape on. Because if you touch your iron directly to clear tape, the tape will melt and warp in a really nasty way, and it leaves like melty plastic gunk on the bottom of your iron, which you then have to clean with iron cleaner before ironing anything else, otherwise you'll get melted plastic all over that as well. I have learned from experience. Please learn from mine. You don't want to do that. So only tape one side and then iron on the other. So that way you can reuse these pattern pieces over and over and you can continue to iron them flat. The first thing to know about these big 4 pattern pieces is what is in the instructions, but is not marked on the pattern pieces. These commercial patterns will always come with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance included, which means that you sew all of your seams 5/8 of an inch from the cut edge. And that small 5/8 of an inch strip of space that you created between the cut edge and your seam is called your seam allowance. Because that extra seam allowance has already been calculated into each edge of each pattern piece. This also means that if you're trying to place all your pattern's torso pieces side by side to measure how wide around your finished garment will be, you have to subtract 5/8 of an inch from each edge. Unless it's on the fold. I will talk about what on the fold means once we get to that marking. If the seam allowance on a commercial pattern is ever marked on the pattern piece itself, it's because it's larger or smaller than 5/8 of an inch. Now, let's take a look at all of the markings on this piece. First of all, the pattern piece number will be printed on it in the biggest font size of all. Right under that, you will see the name of the piece, like front, or side front, or sleeve. And if there are multiple garments in the pattern, it will tell you if it is for garment A or B, or you get it, you're smart. So this number, name, and garment letter match up to the number, name, and garment letter on that legend on the first page of the pattern instructions. Below this, it will tell you how many pieces to cut out of each type of fabric. This bodice has a fashion fabric, which is the pretty fabric that you can see when you look at the finished garment. It has an underlining, an interfacing, and a lining. And this pattern piece says to cut 2 of each. This means that you cut 1 mirror image pair of pieces out of each type of fabric. The only time that you will not cut mirror image pieces is if you are making an asymmetrical garment, and then the pieces will be labeled right and left. They will also say cut 1 and not cut 2. But in general, our bodies and the clothes we put on them are pretty symmetrical, so when a pattern piece says cut 2, it means cut 1 for each side of the body. Now, look at the dashed lines around this piece. They are labeled with size numbers, and to be extra helpful, McCall's prints their patterns with different dashed lines for each size. So all of the size 6 pieces in this pattern will always follow that smallest dashed line, and all size 14 pieces in this pattern will always follow the unbroken line. Not all the patterns use dashed lines, but all of these big 4 patterns will always mark the sizes for different lines in some way. It is important to pay close attention to this, because if you are cutting out the largest size, you would assume that you just cut around the outside of the whole thing, but patterns are usually a little bit more complicated than that. Look closely at this neckline. See how the size 14 starts as the outside line here at center front, but as you move up the neckline, the line shifts to the inside and the size 6 is now on the outside? This is very common on necklines, on side front and on side back pieces, so watch out for that. Now, let's talk about these triangles because they are a little unusual. There is one triangle for each size, and it marks the top of the shoulder line closest to the neck. Here's why it's important. Almost all modern patterns have shoulder seams that go straight across the top of the shoulder, and they follow this line, which is the shoulder's exact midpoint between front and back. But this pattern here has a shoulder seam that doesn't go straight across the top of the shoulder, but it starts lower down the back of the neck and goes even further diagonally down towards the arm side. So knowing where the top of the shoulder line on a pattern is important because that's a point of reference that we need so we can measure exactly how tall this pattern piece is from the top of the shoulder line to the waist in the front and the back in case it needs to be lengthened for a person with a longer waist or shortened for someone with a smaller waist. So this point, this top of the shoulder line is really important for us to know, and that is why it is marked on the pattern piece with this triangle. It is also important to know where the top of your shoulder at your arm's eye is, so you don't sew the top of your sleeve too far back or forward and your sleeves end up pointing every which way. So the top of your arm's eye is marked here with this circle. The circles are labeled with the size they belong to. The triangles aren't, but it's not too hard to infer that the size 6 triangle will be the one that is in the same position as the size 6 circle. In general, circles just mean match these points together. You will see them at the top of pleats, you'll see them on darts, and a bunch of other places. This series of smaller circles marks where this point of the bodice matches up with this circle on the sleeve. You don't always see this, but if the sleeve has any gathering, which is what makes it poof, it needs to be gathered up in a very specific location. The whole shape of a sleeve changes if you smash a lot of fabric into one huge pointy poof right at the top of the shoulder. It gets much softer and rounder if the gathers are spread out over the whole top half of the shoulder. And then it gets really 17th century if you shove all the extra fabric into the back of the sleeve. And that's why the pattern tells you where to align the sleeve using these circles so that you're not confused about how far, like up or down the arm's eye the sleeve poof should start. Note that the sleeve also has a large circle, which matches up with the large circle at the top of the shoulder here. These triangles at the edges are one of the most common pattern markings. They are called notches. They are there to help you match each pattern piece properly to the one you'll be sewing it to. So this center front bodice piece gets sewn to this side front piece, and those notches will match up. These double triangles are also notches, and they are double triangles so that you can easily tell which piece gets sewn here. I have seen up to 4 or 5 triangles on some patterns. You match up double triangles with double triangles and single with single, etc. And when you cut your fabric pieces out, you will cut notches as well. Do not cut notches into your fabric the way they're drawn on the pattern. You cut notches outward, like this. And then when you pin your pieces together, you will first pin the pieces at the notches so they match up, and then you'll pin the rest of the seam. So it sounds like notches and circles are the same thing. They are not. They are not. Notches are always located on the seam allowance and just mean sew this piece to this piece here. Circles are located on the parts of the garment that you will actually see when it's sewn together, so they're always at least 5/8 of an inch in from the edges. They are a more specific and smaller mark, and they involve more than just sewing 2 pieces together along an edge. They're used to indicate the exact placement of extra details like gathers, pleats, darts, and so on. Now, moving down. Here is that nice list of finished garment measurements for each size, for the chest and for the waist. This circle with a cross through it marks the chest, waist, hips, or bicep. So imagine you're measuring around your chest or your waist. That horizontal line around your body is at the center of that cross. On women's patterns, this always specifically marks the bust point, or what normal people call the nipple. Breasts vary a lot in volume, position, and shape, and since garments are shaped around breasts, it helps to know where the pattern thinks the bust point is so that once you're more familiar with adjusting patterns, you can adjust the shape of the pattern relative to where your actual bust point is. Moving down, This double line says lengthen or shorten here. It's pretty straightforward. Measure from the top of the shoulder line to the waistline, which is marked right here with this large cross inside the circle labeled waistline, and then stand up straight and measure from your top of shoulder line to your waist, or ideally, have someone do it for you. It is hard to get accurate measurements of yourself. Your waist is the smallest part of your torso. It is usually 1 to 2 inches above your belly button. It's rarely your actual belly button. If your top of shoulder line to waist measurement is shorter than the pattern's, you will fold the pattern piece along this line. Don't forget, by the way, to get this measurement for your back as well, because the curve of your spine and shoulders affects how long the back of your garment will need to be. This straight back measures 15 inches. But if your shoulders and back curve to create a shape like this, suddenly the back measurement is much longer than the front, even though the waist is the same distance from the ground. When she was in her 90s, my grandmother had an incredibly hunched back. So her favorite dresses hung down about 4 inches lower in the front and they curved up at the back. So when I replicated a dress for her, I needed to make the back much longer than the front to accommodate that curve. And it looks really weird in the hanger, but when she put it on, it looked normal because both the waist seam and the skirt hem were parallel the floor all the way around. If you need to lengthen your pattern piece, you can cut the pattern along this line and add in the extra length with paper. Or you can do what I do with every single pattern I use for myself, since my waist is an inch longer than the Big Four average person. I lay out the pattern piece, mark with pins or chalk exactly where the double line is, mark an inch down from there, and then I cut around the top half of the pattern above this double line, place my ruler along this straight edge to keep the pattern pointing in the same vertical direction, and then just slide the pattern piece down so the double line matches up with my inch markings, and I make sure the edge still aligns with the ruler. And then I just cut around the bottom half. It's kind of lazy, but it works in every situation unless your pattern is really complicated or curved in some way. This set of circles here marks where the skirt in this pattern splits off from the bodice. This line says placement line. It does not say what gets placed there, but if you flip through the instructions, you can see that that is where a piece of boning goes. Center front and center back will almost always be marked like this. This straight line is where the center front edge of the finished garment will be. This circle marks where piece 2 lines up. And now we come to grain line. I am going to have to do a whole separate video on grain line, but here is the Cliff's Notes of what it is and why it is important. The grain line, or the straight of grain, matches up with the vertical warp threads and the selvage, which is the long edge of the fabric that doesn't fray. The cross grain matches up with the horizontal weft, and the fabric is sturdiest in these two directions, but primarily along the straight of grain unless it has some really unusual stretch going on. It is least sturdy halfway between those two directions at a 45-degree angle, or the bias. You see how differently that behaves? That's practically different fabric. Each pattern piece is designed to be cut at a very specific angle of sturdiness so that it wraps around the body properly and consistently without weird wrinkling or pulling. And for clothes that cover the torso, grain line almost always goes straight down from neck to waist. And even if it looks like your pieces have like a cattywampus diagonal grain line, once they're all sewn together, you'll see that the piece ends up being angled cattywampus, but the grain line arrow of the finished garment, where it hits the waist, is still perfectly vertical. Always be as nitpicky as possible about following the grain line arrow when you are cutting fabric until you know exactly what changing that grain line will do, and you are making a conscious choice to change it for a specific reason. To position your pieces correctly, you will match this line with the arrow at the bottom to your straight of grain, which is the long finished edge of the fabric. You use the arrow if you have fabric that looks different if you hold it upside down, like a print or a velvet that looks really light if you hang it one way and then dark if you hang it the other. A lot of fabrics actually have a different shine when you do this, and it really stinks to have a light silver dress with one obnoxious gray side front piece for no reason. So decide which direction you want the fabric to go and then align all of your pattern pieces so the down arrow always points down on the fabric straight of grain in the correct direction. This, by the way, is something you don't have to think about if you follow the fabric layout charts because they will always lay things out properly on those charts. I think this about wraps that up. I hope this series has been helpful and gives you enough information for you to confidently take that leap into the incredibly fun, creative, and challenging, and pretty much limitless world of sewing. If you have any questions I didn't address, or if something is unclear, please feel free to drop me a comment and I will be happy to help. Thanks for watching!